Thank you for joining us for the latest episode of the Secure Connections podcast. This channel-focused series is brought to you by IOTSA, the Internet of Things Security Services Association. I'm your host, Brian Sherman, and joining me today will be Patrick Albert, AVP of Product Management for Auvik Networks. For those of you who are not familiar with Auvik, the company's offerings help MSPs improve the efficiency and profitability of their managed services business. Auvik's network infrastructure RMM, remote monitoring and management tools, give providers greater visibility, documentation, and monitoring for their clients' networks and automate many time-consuming network tasks. Auvik has been named a Channel E2E 100 company, which identifies top disruptors and innovators in the IT channel, and has received numerous industry awards and accolades. With that, I'd like to welcome Patrick Albert to the Secure Connections podcast. Good day, sir.
Good morning. Thanks, Ryan.
Good to have you today. Patrick, as you know, you've been a guest before. I like to start off with a softball question, and I wanted to ask you something that I don't believe we've talked about before: is why IT? In other words, what motivated you to get into tech in the early days?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's probably an easier question than what my favorite band is, which I struggled on a bit last time.
Sure.
Why IT? I think it comes down to me to two main things. I've always loved really, really fast-paced environments, things where things are changing all the time, and the status quo is always challenged, and there's always a lot of forward movement and a lot of new things coming out. I love kind of staying on top of things and all that. So that was kind of where my interest in high tech formed. But IT specifically, I think it really comes down to I'm a troubleshooter and a problem solver at heart. So I love being able to go in and identify problems and go in and come up with a solution and make them better. And that's basically what I'm really, really about. So kind of if you blend those two things together, that's where it really comes into. My interest in IT. So basically solving problems and being able to, merge that with a fast-paced environment.
Very cool. What was your first job in IT?
I was actually in an internet service provider. And it was started out in tech support, and it was on the innovation side. It wasn't your typical internet provider where that was DSL or cable based. It was actually in a company that was kind of in a pioneer stage of broad wireless spectrum. So basically, we were trying to offer wireless internet services to the rural areas back in the early 2000s. So it was really innovative. There was no real established technology brand out there. So we were always kind of getting the newest technology and seeing how it fits into the stack. And it was really, really fun, exciting times. I started there in tech support and then kind of went through the ranks and then eventually ended up being kind of like a sysadmin. And again, on my troubleshooting side of things, I was always trying to automate things and script things and try to make things better and easier.
I think that's the perfect fit for someone who's running the product management side of a software company as well. So probably helps you a lot when you're having those roadmap discussions and laying out the plans for MSPs and partners that you're working with as well.
Yeah, there's always my friends have always joked that no matter what route I would have taken in university, college, or even in the jobs, I probably would have always ended up in a role very similar to this. So whether I went into the finance or high tech, I probably would have eventually converged into the same type of role.
Ooh, finance, that sounds scarier. Great. Well, you've been involved in managed services and the recurring revenue model for quite some time. I know you and I have gone back and forth, in various roles over the years. With innovation and increased competition pressuring margins now, how can MSPs boost their value and better differentiate their businesses?
Yeah, so I think I'm actually going to kind of take a bit of a product management approach to answering that particular question.
Feel free.
Because ultimately, being an MSP and offering services is ultimately a very, very similar scenario to building a product. Because you are building a product and an offering around your product to your customer. It's not a software solution, but it's absolutely a product of how you put things together and how you're solving their problem. And so I think it really, to me, comes down to two kind of major areas, looking at boosting revenue and looking at boosting your value. On the revenue side, we won't go into too much detail on that one today, but that one's really about trying to widen your total addressable market. And that's, taking on new customers, expanding into new geographies, trying to widen who you can actually sell to and adding new services to that. But on boosting your value, especially on the software side, I think there's been a lot of really interesting discussions around this, and it's a really controversial topic. But one of the most important points I would say is understand your competition and who they are and what they service. Because you never want to be in a situation where you're constantly watching your competitors, whether that's a software solution or an MSP, because you'll always be following them. If you're constantly just watching and modeling your business after them, you'll never be innovative. You'll never actually offer your own differentiation, and that's where there's a bit of controversy as to actually whether you should be looking at your competitors. But I think it's important to know who you're up against and what they offer. Never model your business directly after it, obviously, but understand, maybe there's some interesting ideas and maybe there's some interesting things that you can incorporate into your business. But I think largely understand who you're up against is part of that. But I think some of the age-old kind of recommendations around, being the VCIO and being truly integrated to your customers' companies, I think that is still hands down the number one thing I'd be recommending, because it's really truly about being involved in that business, and through that process you will find new ways to differentiate yourself. So that isn't I wouldn't necessarily say the VCIO is the solution to increasing your value. It is a method to actually be understanding what else is out there in terms of what problems do they actually have. And I think that's one point I think that we haven't touched much on in the MSP space is that's the method in which you're going to be actually discovering problems. Because ultimately, any tech company is about turning innovation and problems into solutions. And I think IoT falls absolutely perfectly into that category. IoT isn't a solution to every problem. You can't walk up and say, here, buy this IoT device. You need to be able to relate it to a business problem that they have. And then and only then are you doing the right thing by your customer and offering them a solution. But I think one of the things that that is often overlooked, and it is a little bit expensive to actually do this, but I'd argue it's a very important point, is observing your customers. And what I mean by that is your customers will obviously come to you and say, here's the problems I need solved. I need better wireless coverage. I need backup solutions. Sometimes they'll come to you with those. Sometimes you'll have your own recommendations, but largely speaking, they won't necessarily come up with these innovative problems, or not innovative problems, but problems that require innovative solutions. And I would argue one of the most important ways to do that is through observation. So obviously MSP is trying to spend less and less time on site because it's fairly expensive, right? It's a distraction. You can't be working on multiple tickets and multiple companies at the same time. But I think spending some time at either your strategic customers or some of your bigger customers or some of the ones where you think you can really have a huge impact, spend some time on site and actually observe them while they're working. They might not come to you and say, oh man, these passwords are absolutely painful to be managing, or this is a really painful task that I have to do all the time. They're not going to be coming to you often and asking you that. Observations sometimes will be the only way that you'll discover these types of problems. I think that's one thing I'd love to touch on, because I don't think that's something that's addressed quite a bit, because it's always about trying to come up with what are the industry trends for solutions, not necessarily what are the trends in terms of what your customers actually experience in terms of problems.
Well, Patrick, you mentioned that time investment too, and this came up at our IOTSA Security Roadshow, most recent one too, is I think that time investment is why a lot of MSPs are looking at vertical market opportunities. Not that it's easy to get into and build vertical market things. But if you're investing the time to understand the processes, the workflows, all the things that happen on one particular site, that can usually be replicated with other clients, making you the expert too. Is that something you've seen with a lot of your partners where they're trying to do that, is recoup that time that they've spent?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I was just talking about was more about trying to establish a much stronger relationship with your customer and solving problems that they don't necessarily know about. And I think that is absolutely relatable to, just because that one customer has that one problem, realistically, at a couple of your other customers will probably have a very similar problem that they're not asking you about.
Certainly.
And that's, that could be vertical specific or even not. But I think, absolutely, I think that there's a bit of a negative view on spending time kind of diving into new markets or new verticals, or even trying to spend time understanding problems. But it's key to understand that time is absolutely scalable. It is, those learnings can absolutely be applied to a large variety of scenarios, whether that's vertical or that's just existing customers and kind of your generic segment.
Certainly. I mean, the ultimate goal is to get upsell opportunities and recurring contracts, get them to come back and keep customer satisfaction high. But I could also see, the opportunity when you're looking at IoT, IoT and security, cybersecurity, building those processes in place. It takes time. Any new practice, you've got to develop all of the components, make sure everything's working well, and then translate it cost effectively to your customers. So it kind of fits in what you had talked about is using your customers maybe not as a laboratory, but having the conversations that help you both work better together.
Yep, absolutely.
Great. Well, let's discuss some of the basics. What should MSPs be implementing in terms of network security in 2018?
Yeah, so last time you and I focused quite a bit on the identification aspect of a cybersecurity model.
Mm-hmm.
This time I want to spend a little bit more time talking about prevention and detection and how they actually relate to the network. I've been doing quite a few focus groups lately, kind of exploring this particular topic and trying to help grow our knowledge base and see what other solutions we can come to market with. And one of the things I've largely kind of come across is a lot of the practices that were put in place, let's say early 2000s, haven't necessarily been adopted or adapted to the times of a SaaS first or a cloud first environment. So let's talk about prevention for a second. So that's obviously after you've identified what devices are on your network and understanding whether they should be there or not. The next element in kind of a cybersecurity framework, and I'm using NIST as an example. I think quite a few people do, but almost all the frameworks are fairly similar in this regard. Prevention is the next step. So how do you prevent any cybersecurity issue? And it really comes down to preventing visibility into things that they shouldn't have. So if you look at a lot of the incidents that have occurred in recent history, largely speaking, they are direct attacks on companies, which is something you can absolutely take care of using firewall solutions, and I think we'll talk about that shortly. But there's also the element of kind of the accidental insider. So in both of those scenarios, whether it's a direct attack or an insider that is maliciously doing something that they don't know they're doing, prevention is absolutely key, and preventing visibility is important there. And what I mean by visibility is, locking down a particular device in a network from only seeing other devices that are critical for it to be able to communicate with. So on the very, very basic side, you can do some basic management around the network equipment. So obviously using strong passwords, rotating them, having strong SNMP security settings, and we talked about a little bit of that last time. But what I want to focus a bit more on is network segmentation. So in the networking world, the concept of network segmentation is absolutely, it's been around for a very long time. It's the concept of a VLAN or a virtual network. But largely speaking, A lot of people are still following the basic approach of, in terms of virtual networks, I'll have one virtual network for my wired devices, one virtual network for my wireless devices, and one virtual network for my printers and servers potentially. And looking at most companies, if 10 years ago, that was absolutely the way, that was the standard, that was the norm for how you actually configure these networks. A little bit of network segmentation reduces your risk quite a bit. But in a SaaS or a cloud-first environment where users are primarily interacting with the cloud and less of each other, I think we need to take a little bit of a different look at how we actually do our network segmentation. Because if you look at the average person's workstation, what do they actually need to communicate with other devices for? The joke around the office around, the only need for two PCs to talk to each other is to spread malware. I think that's absolutely becoming truer and truer day by day at this point. A lot of malware is specifically going in and targeting devices that can, get in somehow, whether it's vulnerability, unpatched devices. But the key there is kind of propagating through the entire network. And that's where you start seeing some very, very, very mass damage of things like CryptoLocker and ransomware. So I think network segmentation, I think we need to think about this a little bit differently than what we did in the past. I think we need to kind of go back to the groundworks of, we have this amazing concept of segmenting devices and having VLANs. But if you put all of your desktops on one particular VLAN, they can all still talk to each other and replicate malware. So I think that's absolutely the thing. I think we need to rethink that a little bit in terms of, what do devices actually need to be talking to? There might still be an on-prem server, which is fantastic, but I think you need to think about how those devices need to interact and kind of establish your rules around that, as opposed to kind of the age-old model of wired, wireless, etc.
Right.
And devices like printers, too often do I see them on the same VLAN as servers. And that's a scary thing, because printers are probably one of the most susceptible things out there for attacks and vulnerabilities, because they're typically not patched and maintained as frequently as other devices. So having them on the same network as a server could potentially be a very, very scary thing. If you get into the printer, now you have access to the servers as well. So I think those are some interesting points. I think we need to start thinking a little bit differently around. And then kind of on the ultra secure side of things, definitely seeing MSPs starting to get into a bit more port locking and MAC filtering. So basically saying this specific device is allowed to be plugged in, or you leverage this specific port. And we'll talk about that shortly, but I think that's becoming more important in the IoT realm as well. But before we get too deep into that, the last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of some of the basics and the foundations is around change management. And coming from the tech world and being a tech kind of at heart, change management, or the word process, to be honest, scares us a little bit. I'm scared of the word process. And this is a bit of a tangent, but a process doesn't have to be complicated, because the reality is a process already happens. You're already doing it. You just might not be involving multiple people, and it might not be documented. Now, so I think that we need to get rid of some of the kind of the fear around the word process. But I think the fear really comes down to is something where it's a bit more rigid. Because I think that having a rigid process is where it starts to feel a little bit more bureaucratic. And I think that's probably more where the concern is on the tech front. But the second you hear process, techs get scared, I run away. I think most techs do. Now, sadly, change management, as I mentioned, fits unfortunately into kind of the negative quote unquote aspect of the rules I kind of just described. It's both something that has to be documented and unfortunately fairly rigid. But change management is unfortunately incredibly important. And I think that's one of the things I think that we're starting to see quite a bit more often, especially, this used to be something that was, largely adopted by larger enterprises or larger MSPs, but we're starting to see some of even the smaller guys actually get into change management more. So what I mean by that, and just to clarify, is around before you actually make a change on a network, you have to invoke a process to make sure that, this is both a good thing and it is well documented. And again, techs are a little bit scared of it, but I think that's something that we're going to have to work on this year is just implementing more change management processes and trying to get away from kind of the fear around process and change management. And that, I think that's largely coming down to, just education of the importance of it. It's definitely a topic that I'd like to see more of.
Makes sense.
And on a similar note, implementing a change management process kind of goes hand in hand with actually backing up any changes or configuration you make on the network as well. So that was kind of largely what I wanted to talk about, and kind of the broadly speaking, what we should be looking at for network security in 2018.
Sure. Makes perfect sense. I was reading through, actually this morning, a SCADA security report that kind of touches on several of those aspects, including network segmentation. I think the scary thing is when you think about a lot of small municipalities. I live in one that's about 5,000 people. What goes into their network and how they have everything from the stoplights in some cases that are coordinated in with the PC in the billing department. You think about all the issues that could take place, and even scarier is into the electric department and the grid and everything connected thereforth is, I think there's been a lot of time invested in making sure that's happening, but not necessarily in every one of the smaller communities have kind of adopted the things that you talked about previously. So yeah, it's kind of scary.
Yeah, and I think, again, just to reiterate, I think the way that we've been thinking about network segmentation was more of, more in kind of the age-old way of, how they physically connected, and we should, try to segment maybe the billing department from this other department. Mm-hmm. But I think the question we really got to focus on is, what do we actually need to do? What do they need to talk to at this point? Because I think that has largely changed in the last couple of years, and I think that we need to update our practices based off that.
So do you see IoT complicating things if MSPs and the businesses they work with aren't following those controls? How hard a conversion is it going to be over as IoT, gains strength over the next few years?
Yeah, so I think IoT fits into that picture perfectly, because I think the network segmentation discussion is just as relevant to IoT than it is any other device, and I would argue maybe even more, just because of some of the potential vulnerabilities that we talked through last time. Now, I think you got to go back to kind of some of the basics around, what devices does it need to talk to on the network? Does it consume a lot of bandwidth, and how do you have to handle that? How sensitive is that data truly? And can you actually consider putting it on a guest network or on its own VLAN is definitely worth considering there. So it really comes down to how much interaction does that device really need with the rest of the network? A lot of cases, these devices are going directly to the cloud, and they shouldn't be talking to anything else. In that case, I think isolating that completely from the rest of the network is probably a good best practice there.
And I would say probably from a standards perspective, or lack thereof when it comes to IoT, how do you see MSPs working into this equation on the cybersecurity side, IoT, making it all work over the next few years?
Yeah, well, so I think as I mentioned earlier, I think how the MSPs are going to play into this world really comes down to understanding the customer's problems and staying ahead of them with the right solution. And a good example of this, I was actually talking to an MSP last week, a really good, solid MSP, really great customer. No one had any bad intentions. Everyone was just trying to work together. But the customer ended up wanting to put a very, very basic rudimentary like door alarm solution. So whenever the door opens, it sends an alert. Fairly basic situation. It wasn't designed to be like an alarm system. The thought process there wasn't really around physical security. the owner basically wanted to know when his employees were coming in the morning. Pretty basic scenario. And from his perspective, the owner literally went on eBay, started doing some research, found some devices. One of them was, I think, $15. He's like, hey, that's a great price point. I don't want to have to bother my MSP because this isn't a complicated problem. I'm just going to go ahead and buy this thing. So MSP, using obviously some great software in terms of being able to keep on top of what devices are plugged in, sees this device pop up and questions that and says, hey, what's going on? What is this thing? And what it comes down to is that device was a fairly cheap device, no security, completely wide open, there's no encryption. So lots of data being exposed to the world, incredibly easy to hack if they wanted to, and is a great easy jump point onto that customer's wireless network, which is a scary thing. But to me, what that really says is the end customer went out and purchased the solution because they didn't want to, they didn't want to actually engage with the MSP because they didn't feel that they needed to. And I think that was a critical point of, understanding your customer, understanding the problems they have and getting in front of them. I think has been one of the trends that we absolutely need to spend a bit more time on, and making sure that there's no friction in terms of getting your advice. And there's a lot of different types of friction, a lot of different solutions you can have there. But the obvious ones are they're scared to spend some money getting your consultation advice, or even in some situations they can't wait until their next QBR where they're reviewing their business with you. They just need a solution right now, so they don't actually make that engagement. So I think in terms of IoT specifically, I think it's going to be incredibly important, especially with the consumerization of these devices and how easy they are to get. Staying lockstep with your customer and working with them on solutions and making sure that they don't feel any friction is going to be a critical part to the success of IoT and cybersecurity.
I think a lot of end users still go by the premise it's easier to ask for forgiveness later than seek permission up front too. So, that is a scary part. And when we look at the SMB space, I know I get a lot of pushback to say SMB, IoT is not an SMB play. And we're seeing it every day to where the clients themselves, business owners, are going out and making IoT related purchases. It's a connected device in the end.
And they're not doing it maliciously at all, right? They're just trying to solve. If they think they have an easy problem, and there's a fairly easy solution, and that's it. And so exactly. I think that's definitely one of the concerns that I have, kind of both going forward and realistically today as well.
Right, and they're fun things to play with. People are curious and inventive, and that's going to be part of common nature, especially as the younger generation that's more comfortable with technology. They don't have the stigma of, I don't want to add this on the network as much. It's like, well, I've always just plugged in everything at home and it works fine.
Yeah, and I understand how my wireless network is.
Exactly.
Compared to like 10 years ago, I know what my SSID is and I know my password. So I just plug it into this little device and it's magical.
Definitely. So let's talk about today. What should providers be doing now to better differentiate their businesses in terms of IoT, cybersecurity, and managed services for that aspect? What could they be doing now to basically stand out in what is becoming a very crowded market?
Yeah, I think we've already touched on kind of the most critical components of it, being, as I mentioned, being involved in their business, being involved in understanding their problems, whether that's just listening to them or spending time observing them and spending time on site listening to them. I think that trend exists, that issue exists today, and I think that is a true way of differentiating yourself. Because again, it's all about solving problems that you don't even know you have yet, and that's probably one of the stickiest things you can do, is because that creates a lot of great satisfaction within your customers.
So consulting, design, that upfront work that really helps make that connection with the customers.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think the key there is I don't want to keep emphasizing it, but I think the key is around understanding problems that they don't even potentially know they have just yet. They're not seeking a solution for.
Makes perfect sense. So as you mentioned, it's impossible to prevent everything in these days and age because of the threats and the vulnerabilities, especially some of these elaborate phishing schemes. But what should MSPs be doing to speed their response to network-related incidences today?
Yeah, so much like the server world or the Windows world on that note, network devices pretty much log everything that happens. Whether that's a new connection coming in or someone logging into the device to make a change to its configuration. Network devices, one thing they do incredibly well is log everything that happens. So the challenges there really come down to accessing that information. So most devices support syslog, which is a protocol or a method of basically having the network device push over all of its logs to a target, whether that's like a logging solution or just or something that's not the router that can store these things. But I guess the point there is I think it's going to be really important to take those logs and analyze them. Now, the three problems that I kind of see existing there right now, and I think this is a market that has mostly neglected the MSPs for one reason or the other. I think in the enterprise world, logging, just like change management, as I mentioned earlier, has been incredibly prevalent since the beginning. But in the MSP and SMB space particularly, the technology on the routing or the network device side exists, but I think there's not a lot of technical solutions to help MSPs. I think there's some challenges, particularly around that. And I think quite a few solutions are coming to market, and there's getting more visibility there, which is great. But I think it comes down to three main problems that can happen there. Is the first problem is with all these logs, they're fairly hard to get to on what I call SMB gear, meaning that not the high-end network equipment. So the SMB type caliber gear, the logs are not incredibly easily accessible. A lot of the times you either have to log in over the command line interface, or you have to export it onto another device, and they don't necessarily keep as much history. That's one problem I definitely see. Another issue is around volume. As I mentioned, these devices are phenomenal at logging everything that happens. But if there's too much data, the MSP it's difficult to actually go through that and kind of glean important facts out of it. There's too much noise that it just becomes another noisy source that is difficult to actually review and look at. And as I mentioned already, retention is another challenge there. Network logs, especially on the devices themselves, rotate fairly frequently, meaning that the oldest ones kind of get wiped off. So it's difficult to kind of go back in time to actually review these logs and potentially troubleshoot an issue. So I think in 2018, I think MSPs should definitely be looking at making sure that they have a more sophisticated alerting product around logging in general, and not necessarily even just networking. I think logging in general is becoming incredibly important to the SMB and MSP space. So whether that's Windows or network gear, and when I say sophisticated, what I mean by that is, again, there's a lot of data that comes through these devices or even Windows devices and Windows Event Log. And the market has been very, very focused on looking for specific expressions or specific problems in these events. So I've done a lot of server work in the past, and I remember maintaining a list of event IDs from Windows Event Log that are important. And the problem with that is you didn't know the event ID until you found that event ID after something bad had happened. So there's a lot of practice around looking for those IDs and monitoring for those IDs, but it is a bit reactive in that sense. So there's a lot of sophistication that's becoming that's entering the market around looking for anomalies. So a spike in event logs, or doing a bit more AI around looking for things that could be causing problems. I think in 2018 we'll probably see some entrance into the market that help solve that problem quite a bit. And again, this is not less. This is on network devices, but I think as a whole, MSPs should be looking for logging solutions, definitely.
Great. So a lot more sleuthing to come is what you're saying.
Yep, absolutely.
Great. Be more the network detective. So you've read some great information and insight for us today, Patrick. Do you have any final thoughts before we close out today's session?
I think we touched on some really key components today. I think, taking back a couple of, just nuggets here of keeping your eyes open and starting to plan for the future and changing your practice a little bit to be more problem focused and solution focused, I think is, the thing I'd strongly take away from this, and looking at how you can start incorporating and introducing a centralized logging system. I think that's my last takeaway. I think that pretty much covers kind of the meat of what I wanted to talk about today.
Excellent. Well, on behalf of IOTSA, I'd like to thank Patrick Albert from Auvik Networks for joining us today, and for those who tuned in to listen to our discussion as well. I'd also like to encourage you to take a few extra minutes to check out all the great cybersecurity content on the association's website, iotssa.com. Thanks again, and please have a fantastic and secure day.